The early morning light filtered through the expansive glass windows of San Francisco International Airport, casting a golden hue over the bustling terminal. Megan Harper, a 40-year-old woman with a quiet grace, moved through the crowd with ease. Her blonde hair was tucked beneath a simple black baseball cap, and she wore a dark gray sweatshirt paired with light gray sweatpants, clothing chosen for comfort rather than appearance. On her wrist, a delicate silver bracelet glinted softly, a keepsake passed down from her grandmother. To any casual onlooker, she looked like just another traveler heading off on a long flight, perhaps a working mom, a teacher on a break, or someone simply escaping for a few days. What no one could have guessed was that Megan was the wife of Henry Morgan, the billionaire founder and CEO of a global tech company, and more recently, the owner of Summit Airlines, the very airline she was about to board. Megan had grown up in a working-class family in rural Oregon and had always remained grounded, even after marrying into immense wealth. Today, she was traveling to Boston to attend her parents' 45th wedding anniversary celebration. Henry had offered to send the private jet, but Megan had declined. She preferred flying commercial once in a while. It helped her stay connected to the everyday experiences of ordinary people. At a small cafe near Gate B12, she paid in cash for a black coffee. No fancy espresso, no card swipe, just a small act of normalcy. Heading somewhere special? The young barista asked. Boston. Megan replied with a warm smile. Family celebration. Coffee in hand, she walked toward her gate, unaware that her casual clothing would soon spark an incident that would send shockwaves to the entire airline. As Megan made her way down the jet bridge, her boarding pass in hand, she couldn't help but feel a slight thrill of anticipation. She'd chosen Summit Airlines because, despite the company's elite status, she enjoyed the unpretentious feeling of flying commercial every now and then. It reminded her of the simpler days before she married Henry. But as she stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 782, her excitement quickly began to turn into unease. The luxurious first-class cabin gleamed with wide leather seats and polished with accents in rich navy blue tones. The flight attendants were already offering pre-departure champagne, greeting the passengers with professional smiles. But as Megan walked down the aisle, a subtle shift in the atmosphere occurred. The flight attendants' eyes followed her, their smiles just a little too forced, their glances lingering a beat too long. Megan took her assigned seat by the window, stowing her backpack in the overhead compartment. Her well-worn backpack, the same one she had carried for years, was a stark contrast to the sleek, expensive luggage around her. As she sat, she noticed the other first-class passengers, men in tailored suits, a woman in a silk dress, a celebrity chef she recognized from television. They didn't seem to notice her beyond the polite nods of acknowledgement, but Megan could feel the weight of the scrutiny. A flight attendant, Diane Phillips, approached her with a practiced smile, but Megan sensed something off in the way she looked at her. Diane's eyebrows arched ever so slightly, her eyes quickly scanning Megan's casual attire. "Good morning," Megan greeted her, offering a warm smile and pulling out a paperback book from her bag to settle in. "Good morning," Diane replied, her tone just a touch colder than expected. "I believe you're in seat 2A by the window, correct?" "Yes, that's right," Megan said, glancing at her boarding pass again. 2A. Diane hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering between Megan and the boarding pass, then back to Megan's casual attire. There was an almost imperceptible pause before she nodded. "First class is to your left," she said, her voice flat, but her gaze remained fixed on Megan, lingering with an unspoken doubt. Megan nodded politely, aware of Diane's attention, but choosing to ignore it. She settled into her seat, opening her book, her mind far away from the subtle judgments playing out around her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The tense silence in the cabin only deepened as she opened the first page, trying to lose herself in the words. Just as she was beginning to relax, Richard, a male flight attendant, appeared at her side. His voice was low but firm. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, with a slight edge in his tone. "May I see your boarding pass?" Megan looked up, surprised but composed. "Of course," she said, pulling out her phone and showing him the digital pass. "Right here." Richard scrutinized the boarding pass, staring at it longer than necessary, before glancing between the screen and Megan's casual appearance. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes lingered on her outfit as if trying to figure out how someone like her had managed to get a seat in first class. He hesitated before speaking again, his voice dripping with skepticism. "One moment, please," he said, before turning to confer with Diane at the front of the cabin. They exchanged glances, whispering quietly, and Megan could see the judgment in their eyes. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. A few of the other passengers, who had been minding their own business, now began to watch the exchange with interest. A businessman in a sharp suit across the aisle pretended not to notice, but Megan could see his eyes darting toward her every few seconds. The tension was palpable. She tried to steady her breath, refusing to let them see how much it bothered her. Seconds later, Caroline, the lead flight attendant, appeared at her side. She was poised and professional, but there was a coolness to her demeanor that Megan immediately noticed. Caroline's name tag gleamed under the cabin lights as she spoke, her voice professionally modulated but laced with subtle cold edge. "Ma'am, there seems to be some confusion with your boarding pass." Megan set her book down, her patience wearing thin. "There's no confusion. I'm in 2A first class," she said, her voice calm but direct. "I'm assigned to this seat." Caroline's smile tightened, her voice turning more insistent. "Our system occasionally makes errors, and we just need to verify." Megan narrowed her eyes, sensing the tension was more about her appearance than any actual error. "So what you're suggesting is that my ticket's a mistake because I'm dressed in sweatpants?" she asked, her voice steady but cutting. Caroline hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. "No, of course not. We just need to verify. Is there a dress code for first class that I'm unaware of?" Megan interjected, her patience gone. She looked around at the other passengers, some of whom were dressed casually in business attire, others in clothes just as simple as hers. "I paid for this seat like everyone else. Is my ticket any less valid because of what I'm wearing?" Before Caroline could respond, a distinguished older gentleman across the aisle cleared his throat, speaking up with unexpected support. "I've flown in sweatpants in first class many times," he said, his voice firm and clear. "No one ever questioned my right to be here." Caroline flushed, clearly flustered, and her professional smile began to crack. "Sir, this is between our staff and the passenger," she said quickly, returning to her scripted lines. The businessman, unfazed, went back to read his newspaper, but his words hung in the air. Megan, her patience running low, stared at Caroline with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "So, it's not about my ticket. It's about how I look," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic respect." Caroline's expression hardened, but her voice remained professional. "Ma'am, if you cannot verify your identity, we'll have to move you to an economy seat," she said, the words coming out as a cold ultimatum. Megan straightened in her seat, her calm demeanor giving way to the reality of what was happening. "I can verify my identity, but I shouldn't have to. No one else has been asked to do this," she replied, her words firm but measured. As the cabin held its breath, Megan realized what was at stake. She could end this easily by revealing who her husband was. But she wasn't going to use his name. This was bigger than her. It was about how people were treated based on assumptions, on biases. She chose to stand her ground. The tension in the air was thick. The decision to move to economy class seemed inevitable, but Megan refused to let it pass without making her point. "Fine," she said finally, her voice cold, "but I want your names and employee numbers. This isn't over." As she stood, a few sympathetic glances from other passengers met her eyes, while others looked away, embarrassed. Megan knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Megan could feel the eyes of every passenger in the first-class cabin on her as she was escorted down the aisle. Each step she took toward the economy class felt like a small, calculated act of humiliation. The flight attendants, Diane, Richard, and Caroline, walked beside her, their steps stiff, their silence almost suffocating. The whispers from the passengers around her were deafening, though muffled, as they watched the woman who had been moved from a first-class seat to the dreaded middle seat in economy. Megan held her head high, though inside, her pride was crushed. She was well aware of the injustice unfolding, But she refused to show it. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. It wasn't just the humiliation of being removed from her seat. It was the injustice of being judged based solely on her appearance. She had done everything right. She had followed the rules, bought her ticket, and yet she was being treated as though she didn't belong. As they passed through the premium cabin, Megan felt the weight of each eye on her. Some looked on with sympathy, others with discomfort, but the overwhelming feeling was one of superiority. The luxury of the first-class section was in stark contrast to the economy-class section waiting for her. The stark difference between the two cabins, one filled with sleek leather seats and polished wood, the other cramped with narrow seats, was more than just a physical divide. It was a symbol of how people like her, people who didn't fit the mold of elite customers, were treated with disdain, as if they didn't belong in spaces reserved for those who appeared important. Megan's frustration only deepened as Diane led her to an empty middle seat in the economy section, the most demoralizing seat on the plane. "Here you are," Diane said, gesturing toward the seat, a forced smile on her face. "We apologize for the inconvenience." Megan didn't answer right away. She just stared at the seat, a sick feeling growing in her stomach. "No, you don't," she said, her voice low but firm. "You don't apologize. If you did, this wouldn't have happened." Diane's smile faltered. She had no words to offer, no way to redeem herself. Megan could see it in her eyes, the unease, the discomfort of having to escort her like a criminal, as if she were somehow in the wrong. But Megan was not the one at fault here. She had followed every rule, every guideline, and yet she was being treated as if she were less than the other passengers, simply because of what she was wearing. The other flight attendants, Richard and Caroline, stood just behind her, their expressions blank, avoiding eye contact with Megan. They were all complicit, and they knew it. Caroline's earlier cool demeanor was gone now, replaced by a nervous energy. Richard, too, seemed unsettled, his earlier arrogance gone, replaced by a more passive, almost apologetic look. But it was too little, too late. Megan took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the strap of her backpack as she slid into the middle seat. She tried to make herself as comfortable as possible, even though the space was too small, the seat too narrow. The other passengers in economy class barely glanced up, too absorbed in their own lives to notice the injustice unfolding before them. To them, this was just another moment in their routine flight. But for Megan, this was an experience she would never forget. She sat there for a moment, staring at the back of the seat in front of her, her mind racing. Could she let it go? It wasn't just the indignity of being asked to move. It wasn't even the humiliation of being escorted like a criminal, paraded to the cabin as the other passengers watched. No, it was the underlying truth of what had happened, that the very airline she had supported, the airline her husband had acquired with the goal of providing high-quality service to all, had failed her. And worse, they had failed to see the larger issue, the issue of bias, of assuming who belonged were based on how they looked. Megan clenched her jaw, refusing to let the tears of frustration escape. She could feel the sting of the injustice, but she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. No, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Back in the first-class cabin, the passengers who had witnessed the scene remained mostly silent, unsure of how to react. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others tried to hide their amusement. But there was no mistaking it. Megan had been humiliated, and as she sat in that cramped economy seat, she knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about all those who had ever been judged unfairly based on their appearance, all those who had been made to feel like they didn't belong in spaces where they had every right to be. As the flight continued, Megan's resolve grew stronger. This would not be the end of it. She would find a way to hold them accountable for what they had done, and she would make sure that this kind of discrimination would never happen again, whether it was against her or anyone else. The humiliation was not the end. It was just the beginning of something bigger, a fight not just for her dignity, but for the dignity of every passenger who had ever been unfairly judged based on their looks, their clothing, or their background. And Megan Harper was determined to make sure that something meaningful came from this. The following day, as the sun rose over San Francisco, a quiet tension lingered in the air. Summit Airlines corporate headquarters, an imposing structure of glass and steel, reflecting the beauty of the mountains, stood as a symbol of the company's commitment to excellence. Inside, the company's executives were preparing for a crucial meeting, the quarterly customer experience review, scheduled for 10 a.m. Despite their polished exterior, the senior staff couldn't ignore the growing unease that gripped the office. The numbers weren't good. Passenger complaints had surged by 11% over the previous quarter, and the feedback centered overwhelmingly on one issue: staff attitudes. In the executive suite, Patricia Winters, the chief customer officer, paced nervously in front of her desk. Her assistant had already reminded her that Henry Morgan, the billionaire tech innovator and new owner of Summit Airlines, would be attending the meeting in person. This was his first time attending a quarterly review since the acquisition, and Patricia's stomach tightened as she thought about the pressure. Henry was known for his high standards and low tolerance for failure. The stakes were high. "Make sure Caroline Reynolds and her team are here," Patricia instructed her assistant, her voice betraying the strain she was feeling. "Their first-class cabin service is our shining example of success, and we need to have some positive stories ready." Meanwhile, across town, Henry Morgan stood in front of the mirror in their penthouse apartment, adjusting his tie with a practiced hand. At 38, he exuded an air of quiet authority that came from years of building a successful tech empire from the ground up. His tailored navy suit and crisp white shirt projected power and control, but there was a hint of worry in his eyes as he watched his wife, Megan, sit on the edge of their bed. He had been furious when she recounted the previous day's events, but Megan had insisted that this was about something larger than her. She wasn't seeking revenge for the humiliation. She wanted to create a change in the culture. Henry, although deeply protective of Megan, understood what she was asking for. "Are you sure you don't want to say something to the flight attendants directly?" he asked, his voice tight with suppressed anger. His natural inclination was to use his influence to fix things quickly and decisively. Megan, dressed simply in a casual gray sweatshirt and jeans, shook her head, her eyes calm but resolute. "No, Alex, this isn't about me or them. It's about changing a culture that judges people by appearances rather than who they are. If this is going to change, it has to come from the inside. It has to be about a systemic shift, not just about punishing a few people." Henry sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "All right," he agreed, his voice softening. "We'll do it your way." As the clock ticked closer to the meeting, the tension at Summit Airlines headquarters was palpable. Executives shuffled nervously in the conference room, exchanging awkward glances. Caroline Reynolds, Richard, and Diane, the three flight attendants who had been involved in Megan's confrontation the day before, sat near the back of the room, their expressions unreadable. They had been surprised by the invitation to attend the high-level meeting, but they assumed it was because their department had consistently maintained high customer satisfaction scores. Perhaps, they thought, this would be their moment to shine, to be recognized for their efforts in creating a top-tier service experience for the airline's premium passengers. But they were wrong. As Patricia Winters began the meeting, her voice steady but tinged with anxiety, the atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation. "Thank you all for being here today," Patricia began. "As you know, customer experience is the cornerstone of our brand promise at Summit Airlines. Today, we'll be reviewing our quarterly performance metrics and discussing strategies for improvement." Henry Morgan entered the room just as Patricia was speaking. His commanding presence filled the space, and all eyes shifted toward him. He walked to the head of the table with an air of quiet confidence. There was no need for him to announce his arrival. Everyone in the room knew who he was, and they knew the weight of his expectations. Patricia smiled, though it was somewhat forced. "Mr. Morgan, we're honored to have you join us today." Henry nodded but didn't smile. "Please continue," he said coolly. As the meeting progressed, Patricia moved through the slides with practiced ease, highlighting the positive aspects of the company's performance. She spoke about the high satisfaction ratings for the first-class service on transcontinental routes, showcasing the results of their high-end customer service. "We have members of that team here today," she said, gesturing toward Caroline, Richard, and Diane. Henry's gaze shifted toward the flight attendants, but he gave no indication of what he was thinking. As the conversation continued, Caroline Reynolds, the senior first-class cabin manager, stood to share her insights on the premium customer service offered by Summit Airlines. Her voice was confident as she spoke about the training and protocols in place to ensure the first-class experience was perfect for every passenger. However, just as Caroline was detailing the airline's attention to every last detail, the door to the conference room opened quietly. The sound of soft footsteps echoed across the room, causing everyone to turn their heads in unison. Megan stood in the doorway, dressed in the same casual outfit she had worn the previous day. Gray sweatshirt, light gray sweatpants, and black cap, looking every bit the woman who had been unjustly humiliated and sent to the economy section just hours before. There was a collective gasp in the room. Caroline froze. Her carefully composed presentation shattered in an instant. Richard and Diane exchanged nervous glances. They knew exactly who Megan was, and the realization hit them like a ton of bricks. "Sorry to interrupt," Henry said, his voice carrying controlled anger. "But I believe some of you have already met my wife, Megan Harper." Megan stepped forward, her expression calm, her eyes steady. "I flew from San Francisco to Boston yesterday on your airline," she began, her voice clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "And I was humiliated because I didn't fit the image of what you thought a first-class passenger should look like." The room fell silent as Megan continued, calmly recounting the events of the previous day. It was clear that she was not there for revenge. This was about something far more important. It was about confronting the culture of judgment and bias that had taken root in Summit Airlines. Henry, standing beside her, nodded in agreement. This is about a system that judges people based on appearances, not on the tickets they buy or the services they are entitled to. Megan didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic respect." The tension in the room was almost unbearable as Megan Harper stood next to her husband, Henry Morgan, in the corporate conference room. She had just finished explaining how she had been humiliated on her flight the day before. The flight attendants, Caroline, Richard, and Diane, looked around the room, their faces pale and their postures stiff, as if they had been caught in a lie they couldn't escape. The rest of the executives and board members watched the scene unfold, their eyes flickering between Henry, Megan, and the flight attendants. The weight of the moment was not lost on anyone present. Henry stood silently, his gaze sweeping over the room. He had heard Megan's recounting of the incident, but hearing her speak so calmly and decisively in front of the company's leadership only deepened his resolve. He was not angry on her behalf. He was angry for the entire company, for the systemic issues that were being exposed today. This was not just about a single incident. It was about a culture of bias that had infiltrated Summit Airlines and needed to be eradicated. "Let me make one thing clear," Henry said, his voice cold but steady. "I'm not here as an angry husband. I'm here as the owner of this airline. And I'm deeply concerned about a culture that judges people based on how they look, not on what they've purchased or the service they deserve." The silence in the room was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Patricia Winters, the chief customer officer, who had been trying to steer the conversation toward damage control, was struck speechless. Henry's words hung in the air like a challenge. Megan took a step forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You may think this is just about me, but it's not. I'm just one example of a much bigger problem. This is about people being judged by their appearance, by assumptions made about their worth based on how they dress or how they look. Yesterday, I was told that I didn't belong in first class, not because of my ticket, but because of how I looked." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The room was still. Every person present was now painfully aware of the implications of Megan's words. Caroline, Richard, and Diane shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Caroline's earlier confidence was shattered, replaced by a grim realization that they had been exposed. Megan continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "This isn't just about my experience. It's about all the passengers who have been treated unfairly because they didn't fit the mold of your idea of who deserves to sit in first class. It's about the people who are overlooked, ignored, or belittled simply because they don't look the part." The room was silent, but the executives and board members now understood the gravity of the situation. Henry turned to Patricia Winters, his expression hardening. "How many other stories are out there like Megan's? How many other passengers have been judged for the same reasons? How many have we ignored? And how many have we allowed to slip through the cracks in our customer feedback system? Patricia hesitated, then reluctantly spoke, her voice small. I don't know. We've received complaints, of course, but we classify many of them as misunderstandings. We've always told ourselves it's just a few isolated incidents. Megan stepped forward again, holding a thick folder in her hand. These are not isolated incidents, she said, her tone unwavering. These are patterns of discrimination that have been ignored, buried in our feedback system because it was easier than confronting them. She placed the folder on the table with a deliberate motion. Here are 27 documented cases in the past 3 months alone. Passengers treated like they don't belong. A teenager in a hoodie with a business class ticket was repeatedly questioned by staff. A disabled passenger was treated like a second-class citizen when trying to board. An elderly woman with a valid first-class access pass was turned away because she didn't look important. This is what's happening in your airline. It's happening because we, as a company, allowed it to. The room was now electric with shock. The board members looked at the folder, their eyes widening as the truth of Megan's words settled over them. Patricia Winters picked up the folder with trembling hands, flipping to the pages as though hoping it was all some misunderstanding. But it wasn't. We've been blind, Patricia whispered. I had no idea this was happening on such a scale. Henry, his jaw clenched, nodded. That's the problem. You should have known. But the feedback system was designed to downplay these issues, to sweep them under the rug. And that stops today. Megan's gaze never wavered. What happened to me yesterday was not an isolated incident. It was discrimination in action, plain and simple. It's systemic, and it's in every corner of this company. It's in the training programs, in the policies, and in the way we treat our passengers. Her voice softened slightly. I'm not here for punishment. I'm here because I believe Summit Airlines can do better. But we need to address the culture, not just the individual actions. We need to acknowledge our biases and our shortcomings, and we need to fix them. Henry turned to the flight attendants, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout the exchange. Caroline, Richard, Diane, he said, his voice now controlled but firm. You're not being fired today, but your actions reflected poor judgment. You will be temporarily reassigned to the customer advocacy team. You'll spend 1 month working directly with passengers, listening to their complaints, and ensuring that every person who flies with Summit Airlines is treated with the respect they deserve. After that, we'll move you to the economy cabin, where you'll serve for another month, learning firsthand how to treat every passenger equally. Patricia spoke up, her voice more resolute now. We'll also be launching a comprehensive anti-bias training program for all customer-facing staff. This will be mandatory for every employee, from check-in counters to executive offices. We'll change our feedback system to track and address incidents involving perceived discrimination. Henry nodded. This isn't about punishing people. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their appearance, is treated with dignity and respect. The true measure of premium service isn't how we treat the rich or famous. It's how we treat everyone. As the meeting came to a close, there was a palpable shift in the room. Megan and Henry had not come in with anger or vengeance, but with a clarity of purpose needed to ignite real change. And while the road ahead would be long, this moment marked the beginning of a new era at Summit Airlines, one where fairness and respect would become the true foundation of their customer service. The weeks that followed were marked by an undeniable shift in the culture at Summit Airlines. After the confrontation in the corporate meeting room, Megan Harper and her husband, Henry Morgan, had made it clear that things would no longer be business as usual. The initial shock of the meeting, the weight of the words that had been spoken, reverberated throughout the company. No one, from the top executives to the customer service staff, could deny the transformation that was needed. In the days after the meeting, Caroline, Richard, and Diane, the 3 flight attendants at the heart of the incident, were called into individual meetings with Patricia Winters, the chief customer officer. Their faces had changed since the meeting. The arrogance and smugness that had once defined their attitudes had been replaced by a deep discomfort. They knew the gravity of what had transpired, and, more than that, they understood that their careers hung in the balance. Patricia sat behind her desk, her eyes calm but stern. I want to be clear, she began, her voice even but firm. This is not about punishing you. It's about giving you a chance to learn and grow, as well as ensuring that what happened will never happen again. But this won't be easy. The 3 flight attendants, who had previously worked in the luxury confines of first class, were now being temporarily reassigned to roles they had never imagined themselves in. Caroline, once the pride of Summit Airlines first-class service, was assigned to work with the customer advocacy team for a month. Her task was clear. She would be interacting directly with passengers who had complaints, listening to their grievances, validating their concerns, and ensuring that their experiences with Summit Airlines were nothing short of exceptional. Your job will be to understand how our customers feel when they are treated unfairly, Patricia said, her eyes fixed on Caroline. You will learn how it feels to have your dignity stripped away and then rebuild it piece by piece. Only then can we begin to make real changes. Richard was sent to work alongside Caroline, but his assignment was different. After spending a month in customer advocacy, he would spend the next month working in economy class service. It was an almost unimaginable demotion, a dramatic shift from the cushy first-class cabin he had grown accustomed to. But Henry and Megan's directive was clear. They needed to experience what they had put other passengers through, to learn firsthand what it felt like to serve those they had once dismissed as unworthy of their attention. Maybe then, Henry had said during a meeting with Patricia, they'll understand the true meaning of customer service. As for Diane, her assignment was equally challenging. Diane had always prided herself on maintaining the perfect professional image, but her new role would take her to economy class as well, where she would work directly with passengers who faced similar biases during boarding. She would be tasked with ensuring that the boarding process was as respectful and equitable as possible for every passenger, no matter their appearance, their background, or their status. Diane would be responsible for making sure that every passenger, regardless of how they looked or what they wore, would be treated with the same level of respect and care. In addition to their reassignments, all 3 flight attendants were required to undergo a comprehensive anti-bias training program. The training was not just about following a set of procedures. It was about changing how they viewed the world, how they viewed their passengers, and how they viewed themselves. It was a deep, introspective process that challenged the assumptions and prejudices they had carried with them throughout their careers. The first few weeks were awkward. The 3 attendants, who had once operated in a world of exclusivity and privilege, now had to confront the reality of their actions. They listened to the stories of passengers who had felt humiliated, dismissed, or overlooked because of their appearance. They heard how small comments, assumptions, and looks had compounded over time to make people feel like they didn't belong. It was humbling, often painful work, but it was necessary. The real turning point came when Caroline, during a particularly difficult day of handling passenger complaints, had an epiphany. A young woman in a hoodie had boarded the plane and was seated in business class. Caroline had assumed, at first glance, that the woman had made a mistake and belonged in economy. When the woman showed her ticket, it was confirmed that she was indeed in business class. Caroline had apologized to the woman profusely, realizing how quickly she had judged her based on nothing but her appearance. Later that evening, Caroline shared her experience with Richard and Diane. I saw how I treated her. I judged her just like I judged Megan the other day. And it hit me. It's not about the clothes, the status, or the seat you're in. It's about how you make people feel. You can't treat people like they don't belong. Everyone deserves respect. Richard nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. I've seen it now, he admitted. All of it, the assumptions, the bias. We've been blind to it, but now we have to confront it. By the time the month had passed, the transformation was clear. The 3 flight attendants, once the embodiment of Summit Airlines' most exclusive service, now had a renewed understanding of what it meant to serve with dignity and respect. They had seen the impact of their actions, felt the weight of their biases, and learned how to treat every passenger with the same level of care, regardless of how they looked. Megan and Henry observed the changes in the company, not with pride, but with satisfaction. They had set the stage for a deeper, more meaningful transformation within Summit Airlines. Megan's actions had not only made a difference in the way she was treated, but they had sparked a systemic shift in the company. Summit Airlines was beginning to learn what it truly meant to serve every passenger with equality and respect. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long while, Megan felt hopeful. True change had started, and she was determined to see it through, no matter how difficult the journey. 3 months had passed since the turbulent events at Summit Airlines, and the company was beginning to show signs of transformation. Megan Harper had never sought revenge, but the events that unfolded had ignited a fire of change, one that was sweeping through every corner of the airline. What had started as a humiliating experience for Megan had now become a catalyst for something far bigger, something that would affect not just her, but every passenger who boarded a Summit Airlines flight. The changes were visible, and the results were clear. Summit Airlines had implemented a comprehensive anti-bias training program for all customer-facing staff, from the check-in counters to the flight attendants. The program wasn't just about teaching employees what to say or how to behave. It was about challenging deeply held assumptions and biases that had shaped the company's culture for far too long. It was about opening eyes to the subtle ways in which people were judged, dismissed, or disregarded based on appearance, clothing, or status. Caroline, Richard, and Diane had completed their reassignments and were now working the front lines of the new cultural shift. The months they spent working in economy class had opened their eyes to the realities of being a passenger who didn't fit the mold of what Summit Airlines had once defined as a premium traveler. It was in those moments, when they had to apologize for their previous assumptions, when they were forced to listen to passenger stories and acknowledge their mistakes, that they began to understand the importance of respect and equality. But the transformation went beyond just a few individuals. The entire airline began to change. The feedback system that had once buried complaints and minimized passengers' concerns was revamped. Now, every complaint, no matter how small, was taken seriously and addressed promptly. A new system was put in place to ensure that passengers who felt they had been treated unfairly were not only heard, but also provided with resolutions that went beyond mere compensation. They were given a chance to voice their frustrations, and those frustrations were met with genuine efforts to fix the systemic issues that had long been ignored. Megan and Henry Morgan had taken the steps necessary to implement these changes, but they knew that the journey was far from over. They were not satisfied with a few weeks of good behavior. They wanted to see lasting, sustainable change, and that meant making sure the lessons learned were instilled in every employee, from the newest hire to the top executives. Henry had made it clear that this transformation would be an ongoing process, not a one-time fix. He was committed to ensuring that Summit Airlines would never fall back into old habits of discrimination, no matter how subtle. The changes in customer satisfaction were immediate. Passengers who had once felt ignored or disrespected began to speak up, and their voices were no longer lost in the noise. Summit Airlines saw an increase in positive feedback, with many passengers specifically praising the airline for its new commitment to treating everyone equally, regardless of their appearance or status. The once elitist image of Summit Airlines was slowly being replaced by one that celebrated diversity, respect, and inclusion. Megan's fight for change had not only affected the way the company operated internally, but had also shifted its public perception. It wasn't just the passengers who noticed the difference. Employee morale had skyrocketed. The staff, once divided by invisible lines of privilege, now felt empowered. They were no longer just following the rules of a company that valued appearances over substance. They were part of a team that was dedicated to making people feel welcome, valued, and respected, no matter their background. The training had changed how they saw their jobs, how they saw each other, and how they saw the people they served. And that had an undeniable impact on how they interacted with passengers. The shift also caught the attention of other airlines in the industry. Summit Airlines' bold stance on inclusivity and anti-bias training became a point of reference for others looking to make their own operations more equitable. Several other major airlines reached out, wanted to learn from Summit's experience and implement similar programs within their own organizations. Summit Airlines, once just another competitor in a saturated market, was now seen as a leader, an airline that had embraced real, systemic change and was setting a new standard for what customer service should look like. Meanwhile, Megan's experience had not been forgotten. She had become a symbol of the power of standing up against injustice, not with anger or revenge, but with commitment to accountability and education. She was often approached by passengers and even staff members who thanked her for her courage and for being the catalyst that made Summit Airlines a better place. Megan was never one to seek attention. But it became clear that her quiet resolve had inspired a ripple effect that was being felt across the company and beyond. 3 months after that fateful meeting, Megan sat back in the first-class cabin of Summit Airlines Flight 923, bound for San Francisco. She was dressed in the same casual outfit, a gray sweatshirt and light sweatpants, and she felt the same sense of quiet satisfaction that had come over her the last time she had flown. But this time, there was no judgment, no questioning of her right to be there. She was simply another passenger, enjoying the comforts of the flight, knowing that things had changed, and they had changed for the better. As she sipped her coffee, Richard, the flight attendant who had once looked at her with skepticism, approached her seat. His demeanor was completely different now. He was calm, respectful, and, most importantly, genuine. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," he said with a smile. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" Megan looked up and smiled back. "Just some water, please, Richard," she replied. There was no condescension in his eyes, no subtle judgment. He had learned the lesson. They all had. In the months since the initial incident, Summit Airlines had transformed. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was moving in the right direction. The battle Megan had started with quiet dignity had blossomed into a revolution of respect, one that was now shaping the future of an entire industry. And Megan knew, as she looked out the window at the passing clouds, that the true victory wasn't just in the changes she had sparked. It was in the small, everyday acts of dignity now extended to every passenger, regardless of their appearance. This was just the beginning. As Summit Airlines settled into its new identity, the transformation Megan Harper had started was becoming undeniable. It was no longer about her personal humiliation. It was about something much more profound. The victory she had fought for was not just the acknowledgement of the wrong done to her, but the shift in how the entire airline, and perhaps the industry, viewed their customers. The true measure of success wasn't just in the changes made within the company, but in the small, everyday acts of dignity and respect that were now extended to everyone who boarded a Summit Airlines flight. The morning sun glistened against the window of Flight 923 as Megan sat quietly in her first-class seat on her way to San Francisco for a climate research conference. She had chosen to wear the same simple outfit, her dark gray sweatshirt and light gray sweatpants, a reminder of the journey she had taken, both personally and for the company. As the plane ascended into the skies, she reflected on how far they had come since the day of the confrontation. It wasn't just that she could now board a plane in casual attire without question. It was that everyone, no matter how they dressed or looked, could now expect to be treated with the same level of respect. As she gazed out the window, Megan's phone buzzed with a message from Henry. "How's the flight, my love?" It read. She smiled as she typed back, "Different. Better." Megan had come to appreciate the little victories, the ones that often went unnoticed by most. She didn't need to speak to Henry's message aloud. She knew that the fight for equality and respect had rippled far beyond her own experience. It was now about a cultural shift, one that was making Summit Airlines a model for others in the industry. The transformation wasn't just theoretical. It was real, and it was visible. As Megan sat back in her seat, the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and services with professionalism and a newfound attentiveness. She noticed Caroline, who had once been part of the team that had judged her, now serving passengers with genuine warmth. Caroline's interactions were thoughtful, her smile natural, not the rehearsed, robotic version she had once offered. It was clear that the anti-bias training program had left its mark on her. Megan observed Caroline's ease in approaching passengers of all walks of life, making them feel welcome no matter their appearance. Richard walked down the aisle, stopping by Megan's seat. There was no longer a trace of the skepticism or condescension that had once defined his interactions with her. Instead, his demeanor was respectful, humble, and attentive. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," he said, his tone clear and warm. "Would you like some water before takeoff?" Megan looked up at him and smiled. "Just water, thanks, Richard." He nodded and handed her the glass of water with care. As he walked away, Megan couldn't help but feel the weight of the changes that had occurred, not just in Richard, but in the entire crew. They had learned to see their passengers differently. They had begun to understand that service wasn't just about the outward appearances of their customers, but about their humanity, about treating each person with respect no matter what they wore or how they looked. Megan's experience had made a profound impact, but she wasn't the only one who had been changed. Diane, too, was a different person. Megan had noticed her earlier, assisting an elderly couple in economy with the same care she once reserved for first-class passengers. Diane had once turned away passengers who didn't fit the image she had in her mind of what a first-class customer should look like. Now, she was patiently helping a man with a cane, ensuring that his seatbelt was fastened properly, chatting with him kindly as she made sure he was comfortable. It was these subtle, everyday moments of care and respect that made Megan realize what the true victory was. It wasn't about personal vindication. It wasn't about proving that she belonged in first class despite what she wore. No, the true victory was in seeing a culture of inclusion take root. The real win was knowing that every passenger, no matter their appearance, no matter their background, would now be treated with equal dignity. The airline was no longer judging people based on their clothing or social status. It was treating them based on who they were as individuals, not what they wore. Megan could see the change not just in how passengers were treated, but in how employees were interacting with one another. There was no more division between the haves and have-nots within Summit Airlines. The staff members who had once felt the pressure of maintaining a rigid, exclusive standard now felt empowered to approach their work with compassion and equality. They no longer saw passengers as premium or economy. They saw them as people who deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. The ripples of Megan's actions had spread far beyond the walls of Summit Airlines. Other airlines began to take notice. Megan's story, her quiet fight for fairness, became a beacon for the broader travel industry. Summit Airlines had pioneered something revolutionary, an airline where every passenger, from the elite business executive to the casual traveler, was given the same level of respect. The message was clear. True luxury wasn't the service you provided only to those who fit a certain mold. It was in the service you provided to everyone. By the time Megan's flight reached cruising altitude, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth it. The small act of respect, of dignity extended to every person now flying on Summit Airlines, with a true measure of success. Megan smiled to herself as she looked around the cabin. This was a victory not just for her, but for everyone. This was the world she had hoped for, where respect was not defined by appearance, but by the simple, universal principle of recognizing each individual's inherent worth. One of the important messages derived from Megan Harper's story is fairness and respect for everyone, regardless of appearance or social status. The story not only criticizes discrimination, but also affirms that every individual deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. No matter the circumstances, we should not judge others by their appearance, but should recognize them for their character and actions. This message can be applied in daily life, where we learn to treat everyone around us equally and with respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. At the same time, the story also emphasizes the importance of change from within by recognizing and altering misguided views to create a healthier and more inclusive working and social environment. These lessons apply not only in the workplace, but also in personal relationships, helping to build a fairer and more respectful society.